Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. This is Jenny Collier from the Robert F. Kennedy Juvenile Justice Collaborative. Welcome to our call today about ESSA implementation, and we're really grateful that we have so many folks on the phone. I think we have almost 30 people on the phone right now, and people are still joining a little bit, but I think we're going to try to get started to stay on time. We have a call today that it's going to be a little less formal than a webinar. It's really a conference call to try to present some overarching information about ESSA implementation, and then also take questions. A lot of the call will be questions from the participants as well as conversation and discussion. And we hope that it's an opportunity to really work with folks in the community to figure out what things people are confused about, need further guidance on, and how we might all be able to stay connected and share resources and information so that we can all do the best job we can to help implement ESSA at the state and local level to provide better access and quality education to young people in the juvenile justice system and returning to the community. So again, my name is Jenny Collier. I'm the project director at the Robert F. Kennedy Juvenile Justice Collaborative. I'll be moderating today's call, and I'm really glad to have of my colleagues who have worked with RFK and others of you on the call to pass ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and to make sure that there are some stronger provisions now in the law to help provide better access to education for young people involved in and returning from the juvenile justice system. In addition to myself, we're going to have on the phone today Gonsoulin, who is the director of the National Technical Assistance Center for Education of Neglected or Delinquent Children and Youth. And welcome, Simone. We have Cheryl Kleiman, who is a staff attorney for the Education Law Center in Pennsylvania. And we have Kate Burdick, who also is a staff attorney at the Juvenile Law Center in Pennsylvania. We were going to have our colleague, Chris Scott, on the line with us from Open Society Policy Center, but unfortunately he's not able to join us today. We will be recording today's call. I want to let folks know so that this will be available to people who aren't on the call today, and we encourage you to share that recording with colleagues as well as any materials we end up sharing after the call. Please note that this call will be focused more on not just juvenile justice issues, but also Title I Part D of ESSA and other related issues. And if we can't answer questions, that's okay. It's just important to collect those questions so that we can try to help steer folks in the right direction to those answers and to ask for additional resources and guidance from the Department of Education. I just want to go quickly over ESSA implementation and kind of where we are now at the 30,000-foot level. And just also to let folks know before I begin, everyone's line is muted except for the panelists. We will let everyone know when we unmute the lines so that we can go into the question and answer section of the call. But meanwhile, if you have questions while I'm speaking or others are speaking, please feel free to email my colleague, Adam Clark, those questions. His email is A as in Apple, Clark, C as in cat, L-A-R-K, at Collier, C-O-L-L-I-E-R, collective, COLLECTIVE.org, at aclark@colliercollective.org. So this is where we are now with ESSA implementation, again, from the 30,000-foot timeline. ESSA became law in December of 2016, and the Department of Education immediately went into implementation mode and held public meetings on both the East and West Coast in D.C. and L.A. to hear public comment about concerns or questions or implementation requests people from the community had. As well, they solicited written comments that were to be submitted by late January so that people could request regulations and other implementation guidance of the law. RFK and some of the colleagues on the phone today organized juvenile justice comments, and those were signed on by, I think, over 70 organizations and were submitted to the Department of Justice. And in those comments, we requested areas where we required more guidance or regulation to implement the law in a way that was as robust as possible. Then the Department of Education put out an FAQ on ESSA implementation in February. That has been updated just this month in May. That answers, again, some top-level questions, more for state and local audiences around specific funding streams and other requirements. So far, there doesn't seem to be an FAQ portion specific to Title I Part D. Meanwhile, there was a negotiated rulemaking process that took place that satisfied some questions related to Title I Part A assessments, and this took place with some members from the community as well as other decision makers. And then other questions were not satisfied by that process, and Department of Education will need to promulgate regulations. And we expect regulations to be put out for public comment as well as to come out with additional guidance throughout the coming months. And guidance being non-regulatory guidance that isn't as binding, but that can help people implementing the law understand what the intentions of the law are and what Department of Education's intentions are in its implementation. Finally, very recently, Department of Education asked for more public input that is due next Wednesday, the 25th, around what kinds of questions people want answered related and promulgated in the form of guidance on a variety of, it's an open call, so any issues can be addressed. And this is non-regulatory guidance, again, but that can help explain how states, locals, and other actors in the community can help implement the law and what the intention is for Department of Education. So I'm hoping that today's call can in part help inform that process of asking additional questions and giving additional input to the Department of Education for guidance on the issue areas we're discussing today. We will submit, again, that set of comments that were submitted in early January and signed by over 70 organizations, but we will try to also include updated questions that people give us today and that we've seen in other places around some of the issues that people are now, struggling with getting down to or discovering as implementation is taking place. So to get it started, that's the 30,000-foot look. I wanted to ask Simone to really kick off some of our Title I Part D discussion around resources and strategies for working on state and local ESSA implementation for that portion of the law. So with that, Simone, can you take it away, please?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Jenny, and it's good to be with everybody. Is the sound okay?
Sound is great.
All right, super. So just back up for one quick second, if you don't mind. NDTAC, the center in which I'm the project director for, is funded by the U.S. Department of Education and is housed at the American Institutes of Research. And if you just Google ND as in dog, T as in TAC, A as in apple, C as in cat, it'll come right up. So I would certainly ask that you utilize the resources on our particular website. And, our mission as far as a technical assistance center, really to provide direct technical assistance to state neglected and delinquent coordinators. There is a neglected and delinquent state coordinator at each Department of Education across the country. And to me, that is probably your first step at really trying to connect with somebody at the state level who might even connect you to folks at a local level to talk with them a little bit more about implementation. This is a good time, actually, for people who wear various roles, from advocates to parents, practitioners, attorneys, to really be impactful. And I think, Jenny and Kate and other folks that are on the phone, I think that's the whole purpose of this call. One of the reasons why we're having the call, in May as opposed to maybe November, where we actually would have much more information. But now is the time that states are thinking about, so what's really going to go into our state plan around the larger umbrella of Title I, but also Title I Part D, which has specific funding that impacts our youth that we are so passionate about and know how important educational achievement is for these youngsters. Just by background, for those of you who are not aware of Title I Part D, there are really two subparts to Title I Part D. Dollars from the federal government go directly to the state educational agency, and at that point there are two pots of money. One is Subpart 1, and those dollars total a little under $50 million for the nation. So that's not a lot of money when you divide it by 52 jurisdictions. You add Puerto Rico and D.C. in there. But those go to the state agencies that operate your juvenile justice facilities. And these are sort of the deep-end state-operated facilities. And these supplement, they were designed strictly to supplement the state program of instruction that are in your state-operated educational programs for youth in secure settings. Subpart 2 is a much larger pot of money. It's nearly $150 million, and it's designed to work with local educational agencies to supplement and enhance the program of instruction for youth who are at risk of entering the juvenile justice system or neglect system, are already engaged in either or both of those systems. So those dollars go down to the local educational agency, and you can look at locally operated correctional facilities who can receive dollars through Subpart 2, community day programs that primarily serve students who are neglected or delinquent, and then other programs for children and youth who are at risk of falling into the juvenile justice or child welfare system, neglect system, excuse me. So it's a much broader expanse as far as the utilization of the money for Subpart 2 as it is for Subpart 1. Subpart 1 has several statutory regulations, and money cannot be used for certain things, such as the supplement supplants sort of clause. So that's just a real quick background, because depending on questions that I ask, I may say, well, in Subpart 2, you could probably utilize this, but in Subpart 1, you cannot. It's much more regulated under Subpart 1, whereas Subpart 2 allows the locals to be to have a little more flexibility with these federal dollars. If you go to NDTAC's website, you're going to find assistance, direct TA assistance to our state coordinators, peer-to-peer interaction via our communities of practice. We have products and resources. They have webinars, and then, like I said, if you just Google NDTAC, you'll certainly get to our website. So that's just, a real quick overview there. And as I said, I think the best person to speak with right now is your state neglect and delinquent coordinator as they're thinking about their state plans. We were on a call with 6 state coordinators last week, and the states are sort of all over the place as to when they will actually begin writing their plans and submitting their plans to the Department of Ed. Some as early as this fall. Some may not be submitting them until actually 2017. So, those are their initial plans. Whether or not that's how it's carried through with at the state level, I'm not certain of that. But I'll just kind of let you in on that little tidbit based on some conversations with 6 different coordinators. So anytime you can get to them and talk with them about maybe some of the changes in ESSA from ESEA, and you may have ideas, resources, manpower, human resources, fiscal resources, or products or research that you want to share with those individuals, they certainly, I think, would welcome that information. With the ESSA, as Jenny said a little earlier, it's very exciting to see the changes with much more focus around family and communities, heavy focus on more transition outcomes for youngsters who are both going into the facilities and moving out of the facilities. So, Jenny, I'm going to stop and make sure that I've covered what you want me to cover up to this point, because I know there are a couple of other people who will be talking. But if I haven't, you just let me know, and I'll be happy to respond to a specific question you have, Jenny.
Great. Thanks, Simone. I think the one thing I would just want to ask, I think it'll be really helpful for callers, is can we send them a link to the individual name and contact information for all the Title I Part D coordinators in the state?
Yeah. So if you would just, here's an easy way of doing that. If you go to NDTAC's website, but what I can do is I can send this to Adam in just a second, and he can get this out before everybody gets off the call even. It's the general link to our website, but what you will do is you will go to state information, and every state is listed there, along with who the coordinator is, their email address, their phone number, and then physical address as well.
That's a great resource. Thank you, Simone. I really appreciate it. I think that'll be really helpful. And I guess the only other question I have is when, you're approaching these folks, and they are in the process of some of them just getting really started on their state plans, because, again, 2016 into 2017 is really a transition year for a lot of the components of this law. What is what do you think would be the most useful thing that people could offer coming from the kind of JJ community or youth justice community and talking with someone from the education community like the Title I Part D coordinator? So
if I was a Title I Part D coordinator and I had somebody who would come to me and says, listen, I have some ideas around the state plan, focusing on whatever the topic might be, I would focus in on one topic, a topic that you are very familiar with. I would not say, I want to come and sit on the table and help you write your plan or address family, community, tribal, challenging state academic standards, transition. Don't walk in the door with, all of that information, because ultimately you do want to be at the table with them to have a conversation, maybe across all of these topics. But I would select the one that you feel as though you have the greatest expertise, you might bring the greatest resources to the table, or might be able to connect them to a resource, say, that you work with all the time. And say if that's pertaining to transition, then I would try to get in touch with them and say, listen, I know you're in the process of trying to address your state plan, focusing on all the changes in the ESSA. We have some expertise in transition, and I would give maybe 3 bullets. This is our expertise. And ensure that it's related to the wording changes that are in ESSA. So, they clearly understand that you are somebody that they need to speak with. And get an appointment with them, go to see them in their office. And then, you can even open the door a little further. Well, not only do we have expertise in transition, but, we also have expertise in working with tribal youth or whatever it is that you feel is your second priority. So I would start with your number one priority, and then move maybe to the second one as the door is open and there is a good dialogue there. And I would go bringing gifts, so to speak, identifying, here's what I can do to help you with this, tremendous task that you have ahead of you in writing a plan due to ESSA's changes.
Those are great suggestions, Simone, and I think help give a good picture of how people should approach this process and these new partners for a lot of states. I guess, too, I wanted to flag for folks, you mentioned wording changes. We also distributed with the information for this call a fact sheet about ESSA and how it impacts, how this new law impacts young people involved in and returning from the juvenile justice system. And so folks have access to that fact sheet, and that's a good summary of a lot of the changes and requirements that the law now has for this group of people. And so I think that's something that you may want to use as a reference before you go into these meetings, as Simone described, to help arm you with some of the information that you need. That's great, Simone. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we're going to have you answering a lot of the questions people will ask. But to move on, I'd like to invite Cheryl to kind of share some of her experiences in Pennsylvania working on these issues, to give us a little bit more of a drill down on activities and strategies she's found useful at the state and local level. So, Cheryl, would you mind sharing with us, please?
Thanks, Jenny. Hi, everyone. My name's Cheryl Kleiman. I'm with the Education Law Center of Pennsylvania. And the Education Law Center has been involved in ESSA advocacy and public comments on the federal level and is now participating in the implementation process with our State Department of Education and the legislators here. I'll also note ELC is one of the founding members of the Legal Center for Youth Justice and Education. So with that said, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the concrete things that Pennsylvania is doing as part of their implementation and state plan. I'm happy to answer questions more about my perceived pros and cons of these steps or answer questions offline, but for now, just wanted to give everyone some concrete basic examples that if they're helpful and applicable in your state, you could point to as work that's already being done around the country. So Pennsylvania has already started the formal stakeholder input portion of developing their state plan. And they've done that because they've said that they anticipate submitting their state plan to ED in spring 27 and made a determination that they couldn't wait for the regs to come out to start what they wanted to be a robust stakeholder input process. So they started that last month, actually. And while, I'm not going to spend too much time on specifics, I wanted to give a few things that I have found helpful. Number one, the Pennsylvania State Department of Education has created a really robust portion of their public website dedicated specifically to ESSA implementation. And in it, they provide links to ESSA resources, which many of us are probably familiar with. It includes news articles and advocacy statements and kind of policy assessments, but it's actually really helpful because it provides insight into who the state leaders are looking towards for guidance and what interpretations of the law they are leaning most heavily on. They've also provided on their website clear points of contact within the department who are working on implementation and kind of what sub-areas of implementation they're working on. Most of those people are generally been within the general counsel's office or the executive office. But again, I know for talking to many people around the country, just knowing who to talk to has been a big barrier. So it's been nice that Pennsylvania has done that pretty transparently. So a little bit about what the stakeholder input process has looked like. I think in March, they invited stakeholders, which includes educators, community members, parents, administrators, service providers, et cetera, to apply to the department to be part of the general ESSA stakeholder group. You could also, in that application process, apply to be a member of one of 4 working groups. Because what Pennsylvania did in their state plan process is identified 4 bucket areas in which they want to get thorough stakeholder input. So they've divided those into educator certification, educator evaluation, assessments, and accountability. And there wasn't a lot of transparency as to why they defined those 4 buckets, but that's the framework that Pennsylvania is using. And they have hired the Council of Chief State School Officers, CCSSO, to facilitate these sessions. And our impression is that they're heavily involved in helping Pennsylvania craft this process and ultimately their plan. And for folks that are familiar with that organization, Peter Zamora has been the seemingly lead point person for CCSSO here in Pennsylvania. A few other comments that I want to note that has encouraged stakeholder involvement is that participants are being reimbursed for their travel costs. Pennsylvania is a really large state, and sometimes this work can be really Harrisburg heavy, which is where our capital is located. So they are covering participants' travel and hotel expenses to participate in the work group. And the work groups are intended to develop recommendations that will be provided to the State Department of Education, and those recommendations will be considered as they're developing the state plan, but of course there's no guarantee from the state that those recommendations will ultimately be adopted or included. A few notes of kind of advocacy opportunities is that this process has appeared at the outset to possibly be a really general ed based process, and input around educationally at-risk groups that we at ELC, and I know many of on the call focus on, are supposed to be addressed through this general process, which is good from an inclusion standpoint, but does raise some concerns for us that those students and their unique issues are going to be overlooked. So there's really a need for advocacy around ensuring that there is attention paid at particular issues or student groups. And while I'll say that input has not necessarily been invited, it has been listened to and welcome when we've given it concretely. So, for example, thanks to our advocacy and advocacy of partners, foster care is now going to be looked at separately in addition to the general stakeholder process, and they're going to do that with a joint group between our State Department of Education and State Department of Human Services. And for that, we were able to leverage the quicker deadlines that are tied to the McKinney-Vento changes that impact students experiencing homelessness and some students in foster care, because those changes go into effect in December of this year. So we were able to convince the State Department that they really need to move more quickly with those recommendations and issue some state guidance. So I wanted to use that as an example of saying that we have found success in pushing for greater attention to a particular student group, and I think that could be used, and we are thinking how to best do that for juvenile justice-involved youth. And Jenny, I think I'll stop there.
That sounds great. Thank you, Cheryl. I think you offered a really good glimpse into some promising practices and strategies, as well as some things to be aware of. And I think one thing to remember about education is a lot of it is local, and so it's important to share these kinds of strategies when you can, when you find that your state's doing something well. We'd love to hear about it. And if you're having a particular challenge in your state, also I think the folks on the call can be a resource to how to navigate those particular challenges. So thank you, Cheryl. Kate, I wanted to just check in with you quickly. We're coming up on half past, so I want to give time for questions. But is there anything that you'd like to add to this discussion from the point of view of folks who are working on the foster care population and how that might relate to some of the work on juvenile justice and education?
Thanks, Jenny. Just really quickly, I think there are two paths here that have been touched on that are really important for implementation. And I just want to reiterate that a lot of work is being done right now to try to get guidance from the federal level. As Jenny mentioned at the beginning of this call, there's been a new request for guidance out from the feds. Within that is a specific request for information relating to students in foster care. And actually, if anyone on this call is particularly interested in that, the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, which is a group that JLC, Education Law Center, and ABA Center on Children and the Law formed, along with Children's Defense Fund, has a sign-on letter already circulating to try to meet that deadline of May 25th which is next Wednesday, specifically related to guidance on foster care. And having this kind of federal guidance search at the same time as folks are looking to influence implementation efforts in their own states, I think is really important, because there are some things that we really want to see clarified across the country. So, for example, on the foster care side, there's a lot of information in there pertaining to, quote, child in foster care, but that's never defined. States are supposed to be collecting information on achievement data and graduation data for children in foster care, and if every state chooses a different definition of what they consider to be a child in foster care, we're not going to have meaningful data that can be compared across the country. So that's just one small example of something where we want there to be clarity from the federal government so that there is consistent implementation nationwide. But with that being said, there is going to be a ton of wiggle room for states, both on foster care and juvenile justice, to develop their own processes And so at the same time that we want clarification from the feds, we also need to be educating and raising awareness about these issues with our states in the way that Cheryl identified. We want to make sure that students in the juvenile justice system and other subpopulations are not forgotten during this process. So advocates really need to be talking about this issue as much as possible, identifying their areas of concern, and really getting examples of barriers and struggles to both their states and the feds as soon as possible, because all of this is happening as we speak across the country.
Thanks, Kate. And again, we'd like to use this call now, and we're going to open it up just in a second for questions, as a way to collect things that people want more guidance on, especially, and we can submit this with our previous comments to Department of Education. But I do, ask that folks, as we take questions, know that there are more than 30 people on the call, and so we're going to unmute your line. We're going to ask that you mute your line unless you're speaking also, just so that it will help cut down background noise. I know all of you might not be in a quiet room. It's a busy day for most people. And then also, if you're having trouble getting your question in or we run out of time, please don't forget you can email your question to Adam Clark. He's emailed you all of your call registration information, so you have his email, aclark@colliercollective.org. Feel free to email your questions in. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Okay?